last two videos that I did, Erasure and Predatory, were filmed while I painted the first versions of these paintings. I always start by drawing rough drafts on scratch paper, and then I do the line work, which is the very basic outlines of the drawing, on tracing paper, usually on rolls of drafting tracing paper, so that I have a ton of it to work with. That's the yellow paper that you see. When I'm happy with the drawing, then I'll often cut it apart and move bits of it around. There's a wing that I moved around for a different drawing. So I rearrange and rearrange things at this stage until I'm pretty happy with the composition. I save all of the line work because some of it gets reused in later paintings. I don't use very many brushes. Most of the time it's just what you see here, and that's pointed sables, and then that flat brush, the bigger one, I use to mix colors. The little one is a scrubber I use to lift off any mistakes. And the big one is used, it's a mop brush. I use that to transfer clean water onto my paper. And I go through a lot of rags and washcloths wiping things down. These are my little palettes. I like to use the white ceramic palettes, mostly because they're easy to clean. Not that these look very clean, but usually they're a lot easier to clean. You know how you write multiple drafts of things until you get it just right? The same thing happens with painting for me. I'll oftentimes go through a bunch of different drafts before I get to one that I like. So here is the second draft of Predatory. I don't mind the very first version that I did, but I think the second version came out better. It has more of an expression in the face that I really wanted to get across. When you're first starting out in watercolor, you'll see all of these rules about how you have to start light and work to dark. And that is mostly true, but I don't always follow those rules. If I'm working with paint that I know isn't going to lift off if I put another wash over the top of it, in other words, it's not going to reactivate and float right off the page, I will sometimes start with my darkest areas and then put a wash right over the top of all of that to kind of unify everything. Some of my other videos on this channel, you can see me doing that with I usually use neutral tint, not black, to do that. If it's a color that I really don't want to run all over the rest of the page, though, like the red on this collar, I will wait until the last possible moment to put that in. I don't want any paint or water to slop over onto this red and, dye my cat pink. A lot of times when it looks like I'm painting, I won't even have paint on the brush. I do here, but in a few moments you'll see me moving the paint around with a clean brush and then pulling some of it back off again with a damp brush. Sometimes what I pull off the page is as important as anything that I put down on top of it. Watercolor, you have to paint with the paper down flat usually. Just because the water will run all over the page and your paint will end up places you don't want it to go. But one thing that you'll notice is that my hand never actually touches the paper when I'm painting. You have oils on your hands and you can easily drag your hand right through wet paint. A lot of painting in watercolor is waiting for various stages to dry. And I end up not signing things until the very, very end. There's the speckled egg, which is me, the feathers from my birth mother, and the cat, which represents the adoption agencies. I talk about that in more depth in my video Predatory, which you can find on this channel. And here is the finished version that I'm pretty happy with, honestly. I think it's getting a lot of the story across. And now I'm getting started on the second version of Erasure. This one has words included in the composition. I decided I had too many words in the very first version, so I cut a bunch of them out, but you can see me putting them in here. I've used ink that I know is not going to run when water touches it, and I've used graphite that I know isn't going to be shiny. These are my water pots. I have a dirty water pot, which is that old plant pot, and a clean water pot, which is the little jar of fresh water that I use to mix up my paint. And the paper that I use is usually Arches, 100% watercolor. There's George. He's my little, mascot for while I'm painting. Anyway, the paper is pre-stretched in watercolor blocks. I can stretch my own watercolor paper. I do sometimes, but this is easy. So that's what I usually do, is use this pre-stretched watercolor paper. And here I am painting with, I'm putting in my yellows. I've lifted off most of the graphite from my transferred drawing before I put down any yellow paint. Yellow paint in particular will make any kind of pencil marks on your page absolutely permanent. You will not be able to erase it through the yellow paint. So that's just something to keep in mind. Usually I have erased all of my transfer markings back to the point where you can barely see them while I'm painting. I think a lot about what I'm going to leave blank on the page. White space is important. If you leave white space, then the viewer's eye doesn't get tired out, basically, of trying to figure out where they're supposed to be concentrating, and it helps them move their eyes around the composition of the page the way that you want them to. And in these adoption paintings, I'm leaving a ton of white space. I'm doing that kind of metaphorically, because so much of our stories are hidden and they're never going to be told. So much of our lives are kind of white space filled in by others. In a way, I'm also leaving the white space for other adoptees' stories, so when they watch these videos, they can kind of fill in their own lives and their own experiences that run in parallel with mine. There are thousands and thousands of different colors of watercolor out there, and different watercolor companies, and the paint varies from company to company. So part of learning how to watercolor is to learn what the different paints are going to act like on the paper. And I pick my paint very carefully, and I also try to use a very limited palette. I end up mixing a lot of my own colors. It's taken years to learn how to do that because each type of paint has a slightly different way that it interacts with the paper. Some of the paint is really opaque, sometimes it's very transparent. Some types of paint will completely stain the paper, so although you can lift the paint off, the paper will permanently be blue or whatever where you put the paint down. And sometimes you can lift the paint cleanly off the paper. So you'll see me do that here and there, where I'll go back in with a wet brush or with a piece of paper towel and pull off little puddles of paint in order to get the shading that I want. Some types of paint do what's called granulation, and that means that the different pigments that were used to make the paint will, some of them will float on top in the water, and some of them will sink to the bottom and sink onto the page, and you'll get really interesting different effects with granulation, but you have to know how to use it because it does add a lot of texture to the page. The fewer paint colors that I use, really, the better. Especially in these paintings, you'll see that my palette is always going to be really limited. I always need to know how the colors are going to interact together, And the more colors that you add in, the more chances that you have to mess it all up. So these are very simple colors that I have mixed generally myself. There, that was me dabbing off some paint. Not all mistakes or colors will lift off. It's one of the super frustrating things about watercolor. You learn how to incorporate those mistakes into the painting itself, but it's also important to know when you have to start all over again. And that can be frustrating, but ultimately sometimes it's the right thing to do. It's just completely trash it and start over again. I guess that's kind of a life lesson right there. Here I'm adding in the shadows. In these paintings, the cuckoos and the cats will frequently have very strong shadows because I feel like my birth mother and the adoption agencies cast very strong shadows over my life that I'm still dealing with to this day. The shadows that I paint in they look gray in these videos, but it's not really a gray. It's kind of a lavender color. It's a mix of a couple of different colors that I've used, and I like it a lot. It's very subtle. If you look at a shadow in real life, it's not gray either. Shadows are frequently reflections of whatever it is that's casting the shadow. So here, once again, here's the first version. And there's my final version. I like that one a lot more. I think the expression on the bird's face is a lot more what I wanted. And I think that cutting down on the amount of words that I put on the paper actually makes the image stronger. And here's that first version of the cat. And here's the last version.